Whether your team is your family, your business, or your employees, staying connected is crucial. You can depend on the Cross Insurance family
Very good.
to provide the best insurance solutions for you. We've got your team protected. Visit crossagency.com today.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Boston.com book club discussion. I'm thrilled to be here with you tonight. Thanks for joining. I can't wait to talk with you all about We Ride Upon Sticks by Quan Barry. You can tell how much I loved it by all the post-it notes. My name is Hannah Harlow. I own the bookshop of Beverly Farms in Beverly, Massachusetts. And I'm thrilled to be joined tonight with author Quan Barry, who I'll be introducing in just a second. First, I want to give a big thank you to the Boston.com book club and to our sponsor, Cross Insurance. If you're new to the book club, you can sign up for the newsletter. We're going to add a link in the chat. I also want to give a big thank you to Paul Swiden, who owns Silver Unicorn Bookstore in Acton. He's been such a big champion of the book club and to his fellow independent bookstores. I think one of the really cool things about this book club is that it introduces us not just to books about New England and by authors from New England, but it also introduces us to various independent bookstores around New England, and I'm really honored to be participating. The Bookshop of Beverly Farms has been around for a while, since 1968. I have not been around that long. My brother and I bought the store in January, and it has been a wild ride, but I love being here every day and being part of such an amazing community. If you're in the area, come visit us. We're at 40 West Street. And you can also find us online at bookshopofbeverlyfarms.com, where we, of course, have books like We Ride Upon Sticks for sale. We ship anywhere in the US. We do curbside pickup. We do local delivery. We're open. You can come in. So thank you. Now for a few logistical details. You'll have noticed that when you joined, your audio is muted and your video is turned off. The chat is disabled for attendees, but we do want to hear from you. There's a little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can use that to ask questions, and I'll get to as many of those as I can. And you can also send us comments. So I want to start by asking you all to start sharing with us where you are joining us from. Are you here on the North Shore? I'm in Beverly right now. I'm at the store. I live in Ipswich. I love the North Shore. I'm excited to talk about it tonight. Or maybe you grew up on the North Shore, so let us know, throw it in the Q&A, and we'll start calling out some of those comments as we go along. Okay, now I am delighted to be introducing you to Quan Barry. Quan, will you please join us? How are you tonight?
I'm well, thanks.
Great. So Quan is joining us from Wisconsin, where she is a professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's the author of 4 poetry books and 2 novels, most recently the fabulous We Ride Upon Sticks, which came out this past March, and just last week was named to Time's 100 must-read books of 2020. So congrats on that. To start things off, Quan is going to share a quick video with us and read a few pages from her book, and then we'll chat, and then we'll get to some of the questions from the audience. So over to you.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for making the time to speak with me tonight. So as Hannah has mentioned, I'm going to, hopefully this is all going to go pretty smoothly. Let's keep our fingers crossed. But I basically have a brief 5-minute video, which hopefully you will enjoy. It tells you a little bit about the history of the book, the area, which of course many of you are familiar with already. But yes, I just want to share this with you. So here's hoping it all works as planned.
Hi, I'm Amy Quan Barry. I'm also known as Amy Barry, Quan Barry, and AQB. This is me in 1989. I look really happy, probably because I know that 31 years after this ID expires, I'll write a cool book. This is what my book looked like back in July when my publisher sent me their first cover idea. My friend Judy Mitchell said this cover is triggering, so my publisher sent me a new cover. My friend Judy Mitchell then said this cover looks like the invitation to some kid's Halloween party. Personally, I can't tell if those are lightning bolts or stink lines. Happily, this is what my book looks like now. This is the North Shore of Boston, where I grew up. This is the city of Salem. Back in 1692, Salem was much bigger. Part of it was called Salem Village. Salem Village is where bad things went down in 1692, when a bunch of young girls started accusing people of being witches. Now, we can't get enough of witches. In 1752, Salem Village decided to put the past behind them and renamed itself Danvers. This was Danvers High, where I and my siblings all went to school. It doesn't look like this anymore, which makes us feel old. This is me in 1978. I'm on the left. For some reason, I decided to become the Danvers High band mascot. Oh yeah, I remember why. Because my sister Heidi was on the baton squad. I'm on the right. Heidi also made the bitchin' kilt I'm wearing right now. She has a shop on Etsy called Toolbox Design Store, all one word. So if you're looking for a ballet tutu, she's your man. In 1989, my friends and I played a sport called field hockey. For some crazy reason, they don't play it in Wisconsin, where I live now. This is our team freshman year. This is me being all edgy and cool and asymmetrical. 4 years later, this is us senior year. That's me, silently suffering from senioritis. This is me with my face painted at a pep rally. This is a field hockey pyramid without me. In 1989, we went all the way to the state championship in Worcester. This is us celebrating being awesome. Because it was 1989, we danced like this. And this. Boys wore their hair like this. We called it a mullet or hockey hair. Like this. And this. Girls wore their hair like this. We called it mall bangs or the claw. Like this. And this. This is what we wore to the prom. And by we, I mean me. This is also what we wore to the prom. As you can see, my dog is really impressed. Finally, this is Barb Damon. Barb was our coach in 1989, the year we made it to the state championship. Barb passed away last year at the age of 82. She's the only person in my novel on whom a character is based, the character of Coach Butler. In conclusion, We Ride Upon Sticks is set in Danvers in 1989 as the high school field hockey team battles their way towards the state championship in Worcester, with a little help from this guy. Thanks for coming, and look out for number 1. Now I'm back. So yay. So basically that video gives you the history of the book. And I thought then I would just read a really brief introductory sort of paragraph where you get a chance, a couple of paragraphs where you get a chance to see the entire team. So basically every fall year, the local sports teams or the sports teams at the school have a pep rally to sort of celebrate the start of the season.
And so this is a pep rally that's about to start at Danvers High, featuring all the fall sports. The only thing that you need to know for this section is that usually it's the football team who goes through the hoop first, but something a little bit different happens here. And then for those of you who aren't old enough to remember, but back in the day, Budweiser beer used to have a theme song, and their theme song used to be, "When you say Budweiser, you've said it all." So you'll hear a reference to that in this section. So here we are at the Danvers High annual fall sports pep rally. Then Principal Yoff was standing at the microphone trying to get the student body to shut up. When it quieted down, he said a bunch of stuff about Falcon spirit, the trophy case outside the main office, the exceptionalism of Danvers High's young men and women, blah, blah, blah. We always wondered if Principal Yoff even liked pep rallies. The guy had a PhD in education from Wisconsin. Did he feel like a tool standing up there in front of the whole student body, yammering on about winning? We felt embarrassed for him when he concluded his speech with his fist in the air and a weak noise that we gathered from context was supposed to be some sort of rebel yell. From there, the rally was pretty unremarkable until the hoop appeared. Karen Burrows and the cheerleaders had just gotten it positioned in place, a big blue falcon painted right in the middle of it, when Jen Fiorenza turned to us and screamed, "Field, field, field." "Hockey, hockey, hockey," we yelled. And before any of us knew what was happening, we were charging the hoop, a herd of water buffalo stampeding on the African plain, Principal Yoff a casualty of our herd mentality. The guy buffeted every which way as we roared past. Jen was the first through, her claw a rhino horn, the paper tearing, each of us as if we were being born again, only to reemerge in a whole new world, all 11 of us pouring through. Abby Putnam, a ray of light, Girl Corey, a woman scorned, Mel Boucher with the dark mark on her neck, Boy Corey hoping nobody was looking at him, Becca Bajelica wondering why she hadn't worn a third sports bra, Sue Hume with her hair dyed Kool-Aid and Crediberry, A.J. Johnson wondering who among us really had her back, Heather Houston following blindly without her glasses, Julie Kaling like a monarch butterfly on its way to Mexico, little Smitty's gnashing madly at the paper with her teeth, be aggressive, B-E aggressive, the other fall sports falling in line behind us, football bringing up the rear, the marching band blowing their brains out, the cheerleaders screaming along to the Budweiser theme. When you say DHS, you've said it all. So just a little taste of an introduction to the book. So yay.
That was awesome, and that video was amazing.
It's the
Loved
prom
it.
outfits that really bring back for some of us of a certain age. Yeah. So
And the music and the hairstyles. I mean, it's awesome. I want to shout out some of these comments we're getting. People calling in from all over Massachusetts. We've got Wilbraham, Newton, let's see, Roslindale, but grew up in Lowell, Boston, Saugus, Beverly.
Saugus Achems. I don't know if are they still called the Saugus Achems? Beverly, the Panthers, Beverly Panthers. Woohoo!
Arlington. So from all over. This is great. Thank you, everyone. And while we're talking about location, I'm going to admit something and maybe embarrass myself to this crowd, but I didn't know that Danvers used to be part of Salem. Do you feel like that is something you hear a lot? And when you wrote this book, did you partly want to educate America on the great history of the town where you grew up?
That's a good question. So yeah, my understanding is that Danvers and parts of Peabody and Middleton, so that Salem used to be, again, much bigger. And so that's something I've just always known, like when you grow up in Danvers, you just kind of know the history of the witch trials. You know, I ended up going to school in the South. I went to Virginia. When I went down there, it's like everybody down there knows the history of the Civil War because their battlefields are there, right? And so when this book was just a gleam in my eye, I was actually talking to a friend of mine here in Wisconsin, who's originally from Manchester. And I was telling her about this idea I had for this field hockey book and that I was thinking of setting it at Salem, in Salem in the 1980s. But I was telling her, you know, but I don't really know that much about Salem, like where the teenagers hung out in the 80s or what was in then in Salem. You know, I don't really know it. And she said to me, she's like, well, why don't you write the book in Danvers? I was like, yeah, that's because nobody really knows what Danvers is to the field, you know, to the witch trials. And she's like, well, why don't you tell them? And I was like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. And when I got that, you know, just because she gave me that idea, it really gave me permission then to really lean into my adolescence in the 80s. Happily, I didn't have to do any research, any real research for this book because, you know, I came of age, 1989, my field hockey team, obviously we made it to the state championship. Like I knew all that. And the fact that Danvers does have such a rich history. So it wasn't just the idea that I wanted to proselytize and talk about Danvers in that sense, but it helped me make the book much more specific. It helped me take the book in places which maybe I wouldn't have been able to do if I had to do more research about Salem in order to set the book in Salem. So it was just a freeing moment to realize, wait, I can actually write this book about Danvers and about its history, and it would be a positive thing. So yes.
Yeah, I mean, you've partially answered my next question, but first I have to call out that we've got Suzanne from the Beverly High School class of '85 field hockey joining us, and tons more. I'm not gonna be able to mention all these, but there's also Danvers High grad, so lots of good stuff. Lots of good participants. Thank you guys. Because now my next question for you, as we're talking about, I want to talk a little bit more about your research process, because you had the history of the Salem witch trials, the history of Salem and Danvers, but also, like we've been talking about, the book was set in 1989. So you've sort of said like a lot of this existed in your head. There are so many amazing references. And I got halfway through and I was like, wow, I feel a little bit bad for her copy editor. Like that's a lot of fact checking.
Ooh, yes.
I want to hear from participants too. Like, what was your favorite 1989 reference? And or just what's your favorite thing about the 80s? And then Quan, can you tell us,
Yes.
like you had to do some research, right? Like
Well,
fact check something. And
I have one of those memories, so.
that's
But
amazing.
you mentioned copy editor, and there is definitely a story there. So generally speaking, like with my first novel, you know, you send it, the copy, so you have an editor who gives you comments about how to make it a better book. And then eventually it goes to the copy editor, whose job is usually the copy editor is the one who like looks at grammar and you know, corrects things like that. This copy editor that I got, she was fantastic. She did an amazing job because she fact checked the book. Usually with a novel, you don't do fact checking because it's fiction. You're making stuff up. But she went to town. So for example, there was one moment when I referred to like the sports store as being something else, and she's like, no, it's the Sports Authority. She's like, Coleman's was over on, you know, Water Street or River Street. You know, she had it down.
Wow.
Everything. Like at one point, this is how detailed she was. There's a section where a character is sewing a prom dress, and I had the pattern. I said it was McCall's pattern 5670, and she wrote back. She's like, there was no McCall's prom dress pattern number 5670. And then the last thing I'll say too is that my sister at the mall, the Liberty Tree Mall, used to have it still has a food court, I assume, and there used to be a restaurant in there, or you know, it's kind of like a fast food place called Salad and my sister worked there, and the fact checker just couldn't find it. She's like, I don't believe this place ever existed. You know, so it was the one thing that I was like, no, I know, because my sister worked there and had to wear the terrible outfit. But yeah, so without that fact checker, I really don't know what I would have done. I will just say really quickly too, that 99.9% of the places in the book are historical and exist. So, you know, there's reference to like Rocco's Pizza or Supreme's Roast Beef. The only things that I made up as far as actual locations, the book opens in New Hampshire at the University of New Hampshire campus. I know New Hampshire pretty well, actually, because I've spent a lot of time there, but I actually don't know the UNH campus. And so there's perhaps a boulder that I made up, but other than that, everything in the book, again, it's an actual place. So
That's really cool. I was thinking Route 1's never looked so good as when I was reading your book. Loved it. All right, so we have to tackle the question of voice because it is the most commonly asked question so far. We've had a couple people ask it in the chat. We had some people put some questions out early, including Caitlin L and Corey M. So thank you guys. So you wrote the book in the first person plural, which I think is like a really amazing achievement because it read really seamlessly. I thought it worked really well. I read it as the voice of the team, but I think there have been a lot of questions about whether that's the case or, you know, what were your intentions, and did you know from the outset like this was the voice that you wanted to use?
Yeah. So again, first person, you're right, first person plural isn't a voice and number that you see very often in fiction. Very famous example is Jeffrey Eugenides' The Virgin Suicides. So in that book, you have a group of teen boys who's watching this family of sisters and who tells their story. So I knew from the get-go that I wanted it to be first person plural. I just wasn't sure who was going to be telling the story. So at first I experimented with the idea that it was the freshman girls team. There's ways in which freshmen oftentimes are obsessed with senior girls and they know everything about them and they try and emulate them. But as I was doing that, and I didn't write very much, I only wrote maybe 10 pages like that, I could see though that there were situations where I couldn't explain why a freshman would have been there to see what was happening. And so then I thought, okay, well, maybe it's the school. It's the entire school is telling the story of this team. And I started that and it was just too big and too wieldy. And so ultimately I did decide in my mind, I'm a poet, and the part of me that's a poet, as you mentioned in the introduction, the part of me that's a poet never likes to say anything. I never like to be tied down about what something is, you know? So I will say that I do see the first person plural as being the team telling their story. And that my joke is that there's no I in team, you know, that's like that, you know, there's no I in team. And so it makes sense to me that they kind of form a coven, they form a hive mind. And so it makes sense that it would be this collective voice. But I will say, so the part where I'll get slippery about it, instead of just saying that it's just the voice of the team, I do think that at the very end, to me, the voice, and I won't say who, but I feel like the voice becomes much bigger at the very end of the book. That
Like that last chapter?
Specifically right at the end, right at the very, very, very end of the book, as the eclipse is happening, to me, the voice becomes bigger than just the team. And I will let people think for themselves who that bigger collective team might be. But yeah, that happens at the very end there. So.
And that's a good tease. If you haven't read it yet, now you have to get to the end. It's worth it. You got to see what she's talking about. Well, I mean, I thought it was amazing. Like, I loved that this was a book about a team. You know, for all the nostalgia of the 80s, what made me feel most nostalgic was that feeling of being on a team. So my two sports in high school were soccer and skiing. And skiing's obviously, you're on a team, but it's, you know, individual performances that add up to a team result. But it's different when you play soccer or field hockey or basketball or, you know, any of these like team sports. And I was trying to figure out what it was. And I've been listening to like an Abby Wambach book on audiobook and just watched the Last Dance documentary, which is amazing. And both of those things talk a lot about trusting your teammates. And you really saw that in this book, that to be on a team means to kind of trust each other completely. But then you also ratchet it up here because they have this secret that by, you know, tapping into these dark forces, they have to trust each other that much more. So I really loved that. And I also love that it was, of course, a girls field hockey team because there are not a ton of novels that tackle women's sports or sports in general. So, I mean, there are a couple of questions in here, like, why did you want to write about a team? You know, why did you want to write about women's sports? And did you have like any touchstones, like other books that were inspiration to you?
You've touched on like a lot of the reasons why I chose to do it. And one is just the absence of that, right? So it's true that my very first book, which is called She Weeps Each Time You're Born, is a very different novel. It's set in Vietnam. It's very lyrical. It's very sad. But I was interested in looking at Vietnam through a woman's lens. Oftentimes when we read about Vietnam here in America, in literature, it's stories told by American soldiers, you know, it's war stories, it's stories told by men about men's stories in Vietnam. And so I very consciously wanted to do something different. Here, it's very similar. When we usually think about sports books or movies, you know, it's Friday Night Lights, you know, it's things like that. If there are things about women's sports, it's like I, Tanya, you know, it's ice skating, you know, we think about gymnastics. Obviously, there was that movie Bend It Like Beckham many years ago, but that's like almost 20 years, you know, and there really hasn't been that much like that since. It's true that since the women's soccer team, national soccer team has done really successfully, I'm hoping that there's just more team sports about women. So there, I definitely saw that there was there wasn't, you know, that there was an absence, and I wanted to address that in some way, shape, or form. Also, as I mentioned before, the idea that because I'm from Danvers, I've always been fascinated with the Salem witch trials and with the thought of like what made these teen girls do what they did. And a lot of it, to me at least, has to do with like the idea of opportunity. You know, they didn't have a lot of agency, they didn't have a lot of power in their lives, but suddenly they did. Suddenly they could just say so-and-so is a witch, and people would listen to them. And they, for about a year, they were rock stars in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And I was really interested in what would happen if you take almost like those same girls, but 300 years later, and you transplant them, like what kinds of opportunities do they have? How do they get into trouble? What are the ways in which they're also still, even though it's 300 years later, what are the societal forces that are still trying to make them act ladylike and to, be feminine or what have you? And how do they try and come into their own, despite the fact that there are still these pressures even in the 1980s? So those are all things that I was definitely interested in thinking about.
Yeah, well, I love when you said, how do they come into their own? Because, I thought the other brilliant thing about The Voice was that, then you could kind of touch on each teammate, one teammate in each chapter, and tell their stories. And in that way, you were able to tackle a ton of issues, sexism and racism and body image. So what was it? And as I was reading it, for some of those issues, you kind of realize, since it's set in 1989, like, oh, we've come so far. I forgot how bad it was. And then there were other ways where I thought, oh wow, it's still really bad. Like, we have made very little progress. So what was it about 1989 that let you say what you wanted to say with this book?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I mean, it's exactly what you were talking about. So the idea that when people think of the 80s, they think it was just funny hair and Madonna and good music and that kind of stuff. But it's like, the AIDS crisis is getting going, crack cocaine is ramping up. I mean, there's all kinds of ways in which the 80s are problematic. If you go back and you look at a lot of those 80s movies, which a lot of us loved, like, 16 Candles or those kinds of things, there's a lot of stuff in those movies that is not cool. The last time I was on a plane, which was a long time ago, but I rewatched Purple Rain. And the music completely holds up, but throughout that movie, he is beating on his girlfriend constantly and nobody seems to comment on it at all, So I wanted to rethink the 80s and to complicate them. So one of the reasons is my field hockey team, this is literally the 1989 Danvers field hockey team. So in that sense, again, because I didn't have to do any research in that sense, but it allowed me to rethink things and to do, like you're talking about, to think about how far we've come. I like to make the joke that the book in many ways is sort of like a green smoothie, right? So when you make a green smoothie, you've got spinach in there, but hopefully you also have apples and you have like blueberries and you have other delicious things. So because I'm using humor, I hope that it also gives me an opportunity to make real social criticism. I mean, there's a lot of social criticism in this book. It's precisely what you're talking about, racism, homophobia, all kinds of things. But because it's comic, it allows people to rethink these things and to let them in to their space in a way in which perhaps if it wasn't comic, people might resist and not really hear what's being said. And so that, again, was another reason why I really wanted to rethink the 80s.
Cool. Why Emilio Estevez?
That's a great question. And again, and I have an answer for it, which people are like, oh, it just seems really random. So back in the day, at Danvers High, I had a friend who, in her locker, it's interesting because we've Zoomed. So I've seen like some of my former teammates, and this has been 30 years since we all played together, and yet we're all still friends, even though, we don't talk often, but we actually had a Zoom conversation at the end of the summer. And I'd also seen them back when I gave my reading in Danvers, back in March. And so just, fun. So they reminded me of something that I had forgotten, which is in the book. But so this one friend of ours, I'll call her Jen. So in her locker, she had, various heartthrobs of the day that she was into. And the two that I remember, one was Emilio Estevez. People reminded me that she also had C. Thomas Howell. I guess I'd forgotten that. I was like, oh yeah, C. Thomas Howell. But then the other person that she had in her locker that I remembered was this actor who at the time, we didn't know how to pronounce his name. And we used to walk around and say like, oh my gosh, Keanu Reeves is so cute. He's so amazing. But the thing is, if I had used Keanu Reeves, the guy is crushing it. Like, he still has a career, like everybody still knows who he is. And so in some ways it wouldn't have the distance and it maybe wouldn't be as kind of comedic if I had used him as the heartthrob. And so the thing about Emilio Estevez that I like, and from what I've heard, he's a super nice guy and he's now doing more, he's still in the business. He's just more as a director and as a producer. But I wanted to be somebody who, so for example, if I say C. Thomas Howell, it's true that another generation of people might not know who that is, right? But Emilio Estevez, because of his family, you know, and things like that, like even though he's not still in the public sphere, people still know who he is. And he was a teen heartthrob. And so it made sense to me that he would be like a great character who we feel nostalgia when we think about him in a positive way. And yet we still have connections to him that we might not have to other teen heartthrobs.
That makes a lot of sense. And, sticking with 80s touch points, we need to talk about the claw. There's a lot of love out there for the claw. There's definitely a question from Jamie, or she just says, I'm obsessed with the claw. And I've had other people say that to me too. So how did you come up with this? And at what point were you like, this is going to be a character?
I think I knew it pretty early on, right? And a couple of things. So think about the claw, as I was just before this event, I was actually talking to a bunch of high school students and they were mentioning to me, because there's a lot of physical characterization. So, there's the claw, there's obviously the splotch, somebody else has the chin, somebody else has the contusion, there's all these different ways in which characters are drawn, right? And the reason why I did that is because the book has 11 different main characters. And when you have that many, which is kind of unheard of in a book, you really have to work to differentiate them any way you can. So it's not just like their personalities are different, but I also used physical characterization, which usually doesn't get used that much, to be like, okay, this one's got this attribute and this one's got that attribute. So it was another layer of helping me keep the characters very separate. And so in thinking about the claw, the thing that I like about the claw, and again, it's not just the idea that I gave her this claw, but it also has to do work on another level as well. So it's a physical thing that helps physically define her against everybody else, but it also does character work. I see the claw as sort of being her id. It's like we all have that. It's the thing that says exactly what we're all thinking, but we're not saying it, right? So it's almost like it's completely unfiltered. And so, like I said, it also does character work. And I don't think I realized like how much character work it was going to be doing when I first, created it. But that was the reason why it exists.
Well, I think a lot of us have memories of trying to achieve that. I never could, but I used a lot of hairspray, and at one point was hanging upside down off a dining room table. Oh no, I couldn't do it. So can I ask about the title? It's a line from The Crucible, yes?
So it's not just a line from The Crucible, it's a line actually that the actual historical person, Tituba, the enslaved woman who was owned by the Reverend Samuel Parris. It's if you read the actual transcripts from the court of Samuel Sewell, I think, from 1692, it's in her sworn testimony. And I have to admit that the original title of the book that I was eventually, my publisher, who was correct, made me shorten, but the original title of the book was We Ride Upon Sticks and Are There Presently. And that's actually the full quote. And the full quote is in the book, but basically it's just what it says in the book, is that she's asked to describe, she's the first person to admit to being a witch. And in doing that, she learns, and everybody else learns, that if you just confess to it, you won't be killed. And so she sort of lays the blueprints for people to be like, oh yeah, I did it. And then again, they're not hung. And so when she's asked to actually describe what the devil looks like, I just love how inventive she was. She looks around the room and she basically ends up describing like the guy who owns her. Well, the devil's about this tall, he's wearing this, and this is what he looks like. And so again, the line she's asked, like, how do you get to the coven in Boston? So she'd been saying that, we go to Boston for our coven, blah, blah, blah. And she's asked how they get there. And she says, we ride upon sticks and are there presently. So that's where the title comes from.
That's so great. Okay, we have a couple questions here. Give me a sec while I read. Pam is interested in the inclusion of boy Corey on the team. Was there a boy on your field hockey team first, and is the first part? And then why did you decide to include a boy? Was this an opportunity to get into sexual orientation from a different perspective, or was there another reason?
Yeah. So first of all, there were no boys on my field hockey team. We did occasionally play against boys when we play. I feel like Wellesley maybe had a boy on their team, but I can't really remember. So it wasn't unheard of to have a boy playing field hockey. And then, I don't want to give too many spoilers, but it's true that boy Corey has a journey, and they go on a journey in many kinds of ways. And because I see this as being a book about women, about girls, in many ways, the journey that they end up going on, I feel like in the year 2020, it represents a journey that people do go on. And I wanted to be as inclusive of the journey into womanhood as I could be. And so that was the reason why I included that character.
Cool. And another question from Annalisa. Can you speak a little bit about some of the themes of race and gender that you explored so well in characters like AJ, Soo-Yoon, Julie, and Corey Y? So maybe we can start with the themes of race.
Yeah.
We just talked a little bit
Yeah,
about.
so obviously Danvers, when I was growing up in Danvers, it was 95% white, it was predominantly white. As you could see from the video that I showed, I'm transracially adopted. So that was my sister in the video. So, growing up, I know that I had a very particular experience, that my experience growing up is not the experience of most people of color, but it was important to me in creating this book to address that. So what that is to be a person of color in predominantly white spaces, what that does, how one sees oneself, how one creates an identity. So I very much wanted to have a character who was in that position. And then thinking about the two Asian characters, similarly, what is it to be the child of immigrants? So for one of them, then obviously in another character, I had the character who is transracially adopted. And again, what is that experience like? So those were important issues for me. Again, going back to the LGBTQ things, again, just similarly, like wanting to tell as many different stories through these characters and having, being able to do that. I think in some ways, if you think about the 1980s and again, movies, particularly like, after school specials, it's true that you oftentimes get the stock character. It's like the jock, the cheerleader, if you think in terms of like the Breakfast Club, then there's like the preppy girl, there's the artistic one, whatever. And so I very much was thinking even beyond race and sexuality and gender and things like that. I was just thinking about like types, various types that we have, and then how to show them in all their glory, like how to complicate them, how to move beyond the idea of stereotype, and to make each of these stories just as resonant and just as rich as the stories that we do predominantly see in the media. So,
I mean, I think that's so cool. And one of the things I love about your book is, and I hope this encourages people who haven't read it to read it, is this idea that, by using this magic to help them, this kind of like dark magic, it allows each of them to be more themselves. And I think through that, we saw each of them as complicated characters who didn't fit into these stereotypes. And I thought that was amazing. And it turns into this kind of, I don't know, I hope this isn't a scary term, but feminist manifesto of like showing women being themselves and being successful. And I sort of loved the consequences, and so I won't say more than that. But
I do think of it, in terms of, I haven't seen it for years, and now I think it's problematic. Maybe it should be, but Dumbo, right? So, I think in Dumbo, the
it's
original,
problematic.
like I saw the new one, so with Colin Farrell, yeah. So that he has the feather, and he believes that the feather is what makes him fly, and then at one point he loses the feather, and yet he still flies, right? And so again, I think that's how I sort of see the witchcraft is working. Like they have that as the tool, but you're absolutely right. Like they come into their own, and maybe they don't need it anymore, or maybe they do. Who knows?
Yeah, that's kind of perfect. Okay, so we had a question from Manny L, who asked, what advice would you give the younger Quan Barry who worked at Borders number 9 and just wanted to be a writer? So Manny knows something the rest of us don't know.
1994. So that's how far back that's going. That's 30? How many years is that? Oh, Manny. Manny was a music seller. I can picture Manny.
Amazing.
It is amazing. Yeah. Oh, sorry. So what kind of advice would I give the young?
Yeah. If you knew you wanted to be a writer at that point, do you have advice for your younger?
I lived it. Again, obviously I was at Borders with amazing people like Manny working there. And it was the idea of reading, and just being, my job at Borders at the time. Sometimes I would work the cashier and things like that, but I was like an events coordinator for in-store book events. And so I got to meet like a lot of different writers. Obviously, one of the great perks of working at Borders was that we had accounts, so you could charge things on account, and then you could go beyond what you're, and so, every month I'd be like, oh my God, I bought all these books and CDs, So yeah, so the advice would be just what I did, hanging out with artistic people who love books. If you want to be a writer, you can't ask for anything better than that. So, yay, Manny, so good to hear from you.
I know, that's amazing. Quan, I should say thank you for being so open with us about your own history and personal experiences. And I think we can all fall into the trap sometimes of conflating the author's personal experiences with the novel. And so I wanted to ask, is there a character you most relate to on the team in the book, or are these all completely made up, or like, where do you see yourself in this book?
I'm smeared all over it. Like it's hard to, I think of it, yeah, it's a smearing, that would be the right word. I'm just smeared all over them in certain kinds of ways. For example, again, I was just talking to high school students and I read a section in which a character talks about how every day they eat 2 bags of sour cream and onion chips and Suzy Q. That's what I used to eat every day. Like it was a great secret. Like I would go to school and I would buy, because my family, again, in the book, the character of Heather Houston comes from a very clean eating family, which I did. But then Heather Houston secretly at school is like eating all this stuff that she shouldn't be eating, so that was definitely like my experience. So there's ways in which like I'm definitely smeared all in the book. I think personality wise, I'm not smeared in the book. It's just like actual details, like, hey, eating 2 Suzy Qs, or there are a lot of other examples again where I'm smeared, or just even things that happened, where somebody like getting hit in the face with a stick, or things like that. So but yeah, so the book, I actually had been asked by an interviewer at one point if our team actually ever did use witchcraft. Because it just seems like, well, did you guys do that? Or like, I don't think we did. But so I don't have a favorite character, but what I will say, and we were talking a little bit before we went live, I do have a favorite chapter, and my favorite chapter is actually the Salem chapter, where they actually go to Salem and they're in Salem for Halloween. I just really love that chapter. I also like love the fact that obviously Salem is very different from how it was portrayed in 1989. Salem now is very hip and fun and edgy in good ways, whereas it used to be a little different back in the 80s. So that's my favorite chapter. But as far as like a favorite character, not so much.
Cool. I think you can say that about a lot of towns in Massachusetts now. A little grittier than they used to be. All right, we are running out of time. So if there are any more questions, throw them in the chat. I think we've got a lot of them covered. There is a question here from Bob, who read your first novel, She Weeps Every Time You Were Born, and wanted to ask, well, he has you here, how old were you when you came to the US, and what did you remember of Vietnam?
So I've been back to Vietnam 4 times as an adult, but I left Vietnam right before, so American soldiers were pulled out in 73. And obviously the official end of the Vietnam War for us comes in 75. I actually left in 74. So I was only 6 months old. So I have no memories. I have no connections to Vietnam as far as I haven't kept in touch with. I don't know of any family or anything like that. So, but I've traveled a lot in Asia in general. Like I lived in Japan for a year. And when I lived in Japan, it gave me the opportunity to explore many countries in Southeast Asia. And so I was fortunate to be able to go to Vietnam many times in researching that first novel.
Cool. Well, my last question for you might be, do you have any books to recommend? We've been reading anything great lately? Are you reading anything for research for your next project? Anything like that?
Well, it was, surprised. I don't read biographies. I just don't, but I'm researching. So I'm also a playwright. I'm just starting my career as a playwright. My first play production will be next year. And so I'm working on a play about the International Space Station. And I just read Scott Kelly, who's the astronaut. His twin is Mark Kelly, who is now the new US Senator from Arizona. But Scott Kelly's memoir called Endurance. And I have to say, I found, because usually like memoir, and it's, I think it's it's written with somebody else. Usually like that's not my cup of tea, what I usually be reading, but I found it really fascinating. I highly enjoyed it. So that's more of a memoir thing. But as far as like literary fiction is concerned, books that I would recommend include a book called The Red Clocks by Lenny Zumas. Beautiful book about women's lives. Like it happens every once in a while. You'll read a book and you wish that you wrote it. Like I wish I had written Red Clocks. I think it's just an amazing book. It's not funny. It's lyrical and beautiful, and it's about women. And again, it's just a gorgeous book. As far as poetry is concerned, because I'm a poet. I started my career as a poet and many books out. One is a book by Erica Meitner called Holy Moly, Carry Me. For people who don't usually read poetry, that would be a great poetry book, because sometimes people think that poetry is really difficult and they're like, I don't read poetry. But this would be like a great book for people who don't normally read poetry. And again, it's Erica Meitner, Holy Moly, Carry Me. And I should also say really quickly too, that Erica Meitner, and I have told her, it was actually, I do believe, her father who coined the term the claw. Many, many years ago, Erica told me that her father used to refer to them as the Claw. And this is many years ago she told me that. And then again, years later, I was like, wait, Erica's told me her dad used to refer to that thing as the Claw. So there's
That's
that.
amazing.
And then just one last poetry book, a colleague of mine, Ahmad Jamal Johnson. It's a little bit more of a difficult book, but it's an amazing book, again, specifically about Black culture in LA in the 1980s. And it's called Imperial Liquor. So again, that's another book that I would recommend as well. So
Cool. Thank you. I love getting recommendations from everybody. It's been such a joy speaking with you tonight. Thank you so much for joining us.
thank you for making the time.
And thank you to our participants for all your great comments and questions. And thank you to Boston.com for hosting this wonderful book club.
Yeah.